Last spring, Cherrie, Corey, and I took a stroll up the old Carlisle Road as far as the site of Thomas Estabrook's 1683 homestead. We had such a good time, we decided to continue exploring Estabrook Country. We turned south to look for signs of spring and the area's other historic site, the pencil factory of father and son team John and Henry David Thoreau. First, though, we walked through glacial history. Across the road from the Estabrook cellar hole, the land slants down quickly to a boulder field. Apparently, the Estabrooks, or later inhabitants, actually fenced off the worst of the boulders, probably to keep their cattle from breaking their legs. This is a glacial moraine. It's a dump of stone. Farther along the track, the boulders became even more dramatic. We thought we had seen glacial boulders before, but nothing like what we're coming up on now. This environment is different, it seems, from the Estabrook cellar hole area, but check these out. Cherrie took some of her students here on a glacial erratic hunt recently, and she said that they voted this as their favorite. For any particular reason, Cherrie?
It's a challenging climb.
Ah, yes.
But if you come and stand over in this angle and look at it, it looks like an eagle with its wings folded, so we call it Eagle Rock.
You're telling me it looks like an eagle now, and I'm missing it.
Okay. Head at the top, beak this
way. Yes.
Wing folded there.
That's rather nice.
In the back. And it's tall.
And a hooked beak.
And a hooked beak. I'll go stand beside it so you can see how big it really is. It even has a heart.
Thoreau has a passage in his journal about these rocks.
The gist of it is that many of the rocks that he encountered in Estabrook had the forms of beasts of folklore and shapes that captured the imagination similarly to the clouds.
After all this trekking through the woods and the buggy places, we come to an esker along the side of Mink Pond, and the difference is extraordinary. You see the exposed top ahead of us, and we'll see more esker features as we move on. There's something else worth thinking about with this esker. Not only was it laid down by a glacier eons ago, but it was pretty much without question an Indian trail long before any colonials ever found it. Indians, like white men, knew perfectly well that if they stayed up, they would be away from the swamps, away from the flooding, away from most of the snakes. And besides, they could see what was on either side of them. Dropping down drastically on each side, we end up with wetland. Or, on the other side, Mink Pond, which we saw before in its cranberry and sphagnum moss end. Mink Pond was only flooded in 1940 to encourage goose hunting in the area. Needless to say, there's no goose hunting here now. But there is a heron hunting, nearly invisible in his stillness. The esker makes its way downhill slowly, meandering back and forth in its serpentine fashion. Man's stone walls, not to be put off, march right across the esker and continue on their way to what is actually a fairly new wetland. We're coming to the scene of John and Henry Thoreau's pencil factory, and part of what we're looking at was the mill pond. This is actually a really interesting site because what we're finding is the beavers improving on man, who improved on nature to turn this into a mill site to start with. By the time the Thoreaus were here, there were no beaver in New England to speak of. Their return has been quite recent, Cherrie, isn't that right?
Precipitous increase in the last 10 to 15.
So we're really seeing a whole new landscape. It's an interesting building of one level of cultural and natural evolution on top of another. The mill that was called the pencil factory, run by the Thoreaus, was not anything very extraordinary. It was basically a sawmill with a woodworking shop part to it. The pencil factory here was one of a number of them actually in this area. There was one in Acton, one in downtown Concord on the mill dam. It was big business in Middlesex County in the early to mid 19th century. Pencil making involves cutting grooves in a block of wood, filling them with a graphite paste, and sandwiching another sheet of wood on top. The pencils are sliced from this sandwich and individually shaped, and then stamped with the maker's mark, or variety of marks, at the Thoreau manufactory.
Spring ephemerals were planted by Minot Pratt.
And a couple of areas of Concord that have limestone outcroppings.
And therefore sweeter
soils. So some of the now naturalized wildflowers in Estabrook Woods were originally planted by Minot.
Interesting that the bloodroot found its way to an island of safety on the foundation of the old sawmill. Then, as if discovering the bloodroot wasn't enough for one day, there in another swampy patch, which has been here longer than the beaver, was a large collection of blooming marsh marigold.
This is spicebush, and the flowers are just full and luscious right now. From a distance, they just look like a yellow fog over the brooks. Estabrook Woods is one of my favorite places to explore in the springtime because it is largely a woodland. It is the place that comes alive earliest. Many of our spring wildflowers are woodland bloomers, and they come out before the leaves. And they are particularly delicate, and many of them only appear for a brief period of time. Some of the special wildflowers include some of Pratt's introductions, including trout lily, columbine. Other plants that are native include false hellebore, which shares space with skunk cabbage, and watercress, which Thoreau introduced in Concord. There are many species of violets. Canada mayflower carpets the floor of the woods in green. And because there are so many rocks in Estabrook, we have polypody fern, which prefers growing on rocks. And we have Christmas ferns and many, many stands of black birch trees, which are filled with catkins swaying in the wind in the spring. Midsummer is really only 2.5 months after the spring ephemerals bloom. But it's time to go back and see if we can find any traces of what was so beautiful in the spring. And also, it's time to close the loop on our track in time through Estabrook Country. Come with us. See what we can find. On the track that is wet from the morning's rain, there's a hoof print, and farther on, among the dappled shade and sun, are bicycle tracks. Archaeological evidence of other people traveling this track in time. The stream that we filmed so artistically in the spring is almost invisible now because of the summer foliage. But it still sounds the way a brook is supposed to sound in the woods. Believe it or not, back in there behind the euonymus bushes are the lime kiln stones that are even more inscrutable now than they were when we first filmed them. Back at Mink Pond, the once clear water is now almost totally covered by the leaves of water lilies in full bloom. And across the way, the Beaver Palace looks like it may have added another layer. And the Esker Trail, that was so barren the last time we were here, is now a shady path through the woods as the canopy has leafed out. And the moss that is greened up really emphasizes the stone rubble that makes up the core of this esker. You can hear the sounds of summer in Mink Pond and its environs. The quiet whoosh of a heron flying overhead. The funny
whiny noise of a frog and the deep glug of a bullfrog. Birds of all sorts are comfortable doing their thing. The excitement of the courting season has gone by, and now they talk to each other and to their new families. We're back at the pencil factory with its man-made beaver-aided dam and pond behind it, now gently covered with flag and fern, birch trees along the edges. The edges of the sluiceway are now covered with luxuriant poison ivy, bittersweet, Japanese barberry, the ferns that actually belong here, lots of poison ivy. And finally, we discover the remaining leaf of all that bloodroot that we spotted this spring with its beautiful white blossoms. A year ago, I walked a different trail in Estabrook with Concord guide Ginger Lang. So we're walking along the trail and suddenly there's what looks like a seep coming downhill from the land above us. Are you saying that this is part of the beaver work?
Well, this looks like new damage to me.
Oh, okay.
I don't believe it was like that last year.
We're going to follow the seep up to the top of the hill.
The beavers have evidently flooded this area so much from Mink Pond that now this is a backwater to Mink Pond that's in here.
Look at that. It's a whole new wetland that didn't exist 5 years ago. So, here we are at last, and lo and behold, the dam. Ginger says there are a lot of new tree limbs that have been added, tree trunks it looks like to me. Now at midsummer, we've made it up the soggy slope again to the new backwater that Ginger commented on, created by the beaver more recently than the big dam directly on Mink Pond. This lovely pondlet obviously stays wet all year. It's home to starlings and red-winged blackbirds, dragonflies dancing in the sun. We have almost made a whole circuit of Mink Pond, going from the pencil factory to the new beaver dam. Unfortunately, I just scared away that heron, who I think was happily roosting above me in the tree. But here in front of us is the Beaver Palace. A truly extraordinary creation. Mudded over, and then more logs added on top of that. It's hard to imagine how long it took and how many were involved. Sort of like, the pyramids of Egypt, but in Concord instead. We've made our way on nameless trails, and here we are finally on what looks like the road home, closing the loop. Before we leave Estabrook Country, though, listen to what Cherrie had to say when I walked with her this spring.
I encourage you all to enjoy this unique and precious resource and to see yourselves both as lovers of this land and as stewards of this special place so that it may continue to be protected for centuries to come.